Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa came downstairs for dinner to find her family already seated at the dining room table. But something was terribly wrong. They were all sitting perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps, staring straight ahead with blank expressions. The table was set for dinner, but the plates contained food that Peppa didn't recognize. Dark, shapeless masses that seemed to move slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George all turned to look at her simultaneously, their movements perfectly synchronized like clockwork dolls. Their smiles were too wide, stretching across their faces in ways that looked painful, and their eyes were completely black, reflecting no light at all. "Sit down, Peppa," they said in unison, their voices flat and emotionless. "It's time for dinner." Peppa approached the table cautiously and saw that her chair was the only one without the strange, moving food. Instead, her plate held what looked like a normal meal, but as she got closer, she realized the food was arranged to spell out words, "Join US." The family continued to stare at her with those horrible smiles, waiting for her to sit down. When she hesitated, they all tilted their heads to the side at exactly the same angle, the movement creating a soft clicking sound like breaking bones. "Sit down, Peppa," they repeated, and this time their voices echoed strangely, as if coming from far away. Peppa noticed that the dining room seemed larger than usual, the walls stretching away into darkness beyond the reach of the overhead light. The family began to eat their strange food with mechanical movements, never breaking eye contact with her, never blinking. As they ate, their smiles grew even wider, and Peppa could see that their teeth had become sharp and pointed. The food on her plate began to rearrange itself, the letters changing to spell out new words. "Stay forever." Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Mummy Pig was preparing dinner, but the food on the table began to move on its own. The carrots wriggled like worms, the potatoes pulsed with a faint, internal light, and the peas rolled off the plate and scurried across the floor like tiny, green insects. The familiar aroma of cooking was replaced by a strange, earthy smell, mixed with something sweet and sickly. Peppa and George watched in horror as the vegetables began to coalesce, forming a grotesque, pulsating mass in the center of the table. It grew larger, slowly taking on a vaguely humanoid shape, with two glowing green eyes emerging from its surface. Mummy Pig, her back turned, continued to hum, oblivious to the monstrous transformation occurring behind her. The kitchen grew cold, and the familiar sounds of cooking were replaced by a faint, squelching noise. The monstrous vegetable creature began to twitch, then to rise, its form dripping with a viscous, green liquid. It let out a low, guttural groan, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The kitchen, once a place of nourishment, was now a scene of unimaginable horror. The familiar comfort of their home was replaced by a chilling sense of dread, as the food they were about to eat transformed into a living nightmare. The creature took a step, its root-like feet squelching on the tiled floor. It reached out a tendril, its glowing eyes fixed on Peppa. The house was no longer safe, for a monstrous hunger had awakened within its walls. The familiar comfort of their dinner time had become a terrifying encounter with a sentient, malevolent entity. The food was alive and it was hungry.
This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, voices on the second floor. It was a late evening in the Pig family's house. The wind howled outside, rushing through the dark streets. Rain drummed against the roof, trickling down the windows in thin streams. Everything seemed like a normal rainy night, yet something in the air felt wrong. Peppa and George sat in the living room, wrapped in warm blankets. The television flickered with a silly program, but neither of them could focus on the screen. The house was too quiet. Even the sound of the rain felt muted, as if the walls had thickened. Then they heard it. Voices. They came from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking on the second floor and talking. But they both knew that Mummy and Daddy Pig had already gone to bed. Their door was closed. There was no one else in the house. Peppa froze. George clutched his dinosaur. The voices were muffled but clear. The words were indistinct, yet it was obvious that someone was speaking. A whisper, a quiet laugh, slow footsteps, the floor creaking under the weight. Peppa lifted her head, staring at the staircase. The second floor was swallowed by darkness. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the top step was sinking into a void. The voices didn't stop. They sounded wrong, like someone was pretending to sound familiar, but was failing. The voices grew closer. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs, and then they began to descend. Step, pause, step, pause. Something was coming down. Peppa and George didn't move. Their hearts pounded so loudly that it felt like the whole house could hear them. But the worst was yet to come. When it reached the middle of the staircase, the upstairs light flickered. For a brief moment, they saw a shadow, tall, stretched, and completely still. The footsteps continued. The voices were right there. Peppa couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed George's hoof and squeezed her eyes shut. And suddenly, everything stopped. No more footsteps, no more voices, only silence. Peppa slowly opened her eyes. The top of the stairs was empty, but she knew that something was still there. It just didn't want to be seen.
This is the story of what happened when Peppa Pig's family went to the beach for what they thought would be a normal day. But sometimes, the most dangerous predators wear the most innocent disguises. It was a sunny day when the pig family arrived at the beach. Peppa was building sandcastles when she noticed strange footprints in the sand. Clear impressions of sneakers leading directly from the ocean onto the beach. "Daddy, look at these footprints," Peppa called out. Daddy Pig chuckled. Someone probably just walked into the water wearing their shoes. But Peppa followed the sneaker prints towards some large rocks. As she got closer, she heard soft, melodic humming. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. Peppa crept around the rocks and gasped. Sitting on the sand was an enormous shark wearing bright blue Nike sneakers, singing happily to itself. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, the shark sang, noticing Peppa. It grinned with rows of sharp teeth. "Hello there! Want to play?" Despite her fear, Peppa found herself playing beach ball with the creature, watching as it skillfully kicked the ball with its sneaker-clad fins. "You're really good at this," Peppa laughed. "Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la! I love to play," the shark sang back. That evening, a loud knock echoed through their house. When Daddy Pig opened the door, there stood the shark, still wearing its blue sneakers. "Hello, I've come to visit. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la," the shark announced, pushing inside and making itself at home. The shark squeezed through the doorway and began devouring everything at the dinner table. Plates, food, even the tablecloth. "What on earth is happening?" Mummy Pig exclaimed. "I was hungry. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la." It sang with its mouth full. From that day forward, everything changed. The shark decided to stay and established new rules. Everyone had to wear sneakers and sing tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la throughout the day. The shark took over Peppa's bedroom, forcing her to sleep on a mat. One night, Peppa and George tried to sneak out, but the shark was waiting at the door. "Where do you think you're going? Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, nobody leaves my family." It sang menacingly, dragging them back inside. The house transformed quickly. Windows were sealed with thick glass, water filled the lower floors, and a sign appeared reading, "Danger, aggressive shark inside." Neighbors would walk by and hear singing from inside, "Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la." We're all one family now. Through the round window, you could see them. Peppa, George, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, all wearing blue sneakers, all singing the shark's song. Behind them, the massive silhouette swam in circles, its toothy grin never fading. And so the shark had found its perfect family. The beach was quiet again, but if you listen carefully, you might still hear it. Tra-la-lee-lo, tra-la-la. And if you do, you'd better run, because the shark is always looking for new family members to join its endless song.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was helping Mummy Pig water the plants in the garden, but the flowers seemed to wilt and turn black as soon as the water touched them. The vibrant green leaves shriveled, and the colorful petals curled inward, revealing thorny, twisted stems. The soil beneath their feet began to crack and crumble, revealing not earth, but a dark, pulsating mass. A low, rhythmic thumping sound emanated from deep within the ground, like a giant heart beating. The air grew heavy with the scent of decay and something sweet, yet sickly. The familiar garden gnomes, usually so cheerful, now had vacant, staring eyes, their painted smiles frozen in a grotesque rictus. The garden, once a place of beauty and life, was transforming into a barren wasteland. The thumping grew louder, and the ground beneath them trembled. Dark, thorny vines erupted from the cracked earth, snaking their way around the wilting plants, their thorns dripping with a viscous, black liquid. The sun, usually so bright, was obscured by a thick, unnatural mist that rolled in from the edges of the garden. The sound of buzzing insects filled the air, but these were not ordinary bees. They were large, black, and their wings beat with an ominous hum. The garden shed, usually a place for tools, now seemed to pulse with an internal, sickly green light. The plants, once their friends, were now turning against them, their thorny branches reaching out like grasping claws. The garden was no longer a place of growth, but of consumption, slowly devouring everything in its path. The thumping intensified, and a large, dark maw opened in the center of the garden, revealing rows of jagged, crystalline teeth. The house, their home, felt miles away, and the garden had become a living, breathing nightmare.
The day was damp and overcast. Rain had fallen since morning, and only by evening did it subside, leaving the yard filled with shining puddles and wet grass. Peppa and George ran outside, jumping in the puddles, laughing, building a little tower of stones. Everything seemed ordinary. Inside the house smelled of dinner, and from the kitchen came Mummy Pig's voice. But when the sun finally disappeared, a strange sound drifted from the forest. It wasn't barking, nor the creak of wind. Heavy, dragging breaths, as if something enormous was slowly moving between the trees. Peppa stopped and peered into the thicket. There, in the shadows, stood a tall figure. At first she thought it was a deer, but its steps were too slow, too heavy. Each hoofbeat sent a shudder through the ground. And then Peppa saw the eyes, red, burning like embers in the dark. Massive antlers tangled with branches as if the forest itself had grown through the creature. "Peppa!" George whispered, clutching her hand. The figure took a step forward. The ground trembled. The children screamed and rushed to the house. Daddy Pig flung open the door and pulled them inside, quickly locking the bolts. In the same moment, the silhouette loomed over the windows, and the antlers scraped across the roof, leaving long scars. The house grew cold, the air thickened, the lamps flickered. In the glass appeared not their familiar reflections, but shadows with crimson eyes. Mummy Pig clutched George, and Peppa felt the walls were breathing, letting in strange sounds, the whisper of branches, the crack of bark. The monster did not leave. It slowly circled the house. Each step left deep hoof prints, and those prints seemed to echo inside as well. The floor shuddered, the walls groaned, the ceiling cracked. The house responded to every movement. Daddy Pig tried to draw the curtains, but the fabric clung to the glass. Beyond the window, there was no yard, only thicket, dense and endless. The moon broke through the branches, and between them, the red eyes flared again. The creature came closer. Its antlers struck the wall, and cracks spread through the wood. Shadows stretched out, forming shapes like hands. Peppa and George pressed themselves against their mother. "He won't leave," Peppa whispered. The monster loomed on every side. Its breath was heard everywhere, from beneath the floor, from the corridors, from the very roof. The air turned icy, and each breath came heavy, as if the house itself lived and breathed with it. In the living room, the light went out. In the darkness, only the eyes remained. They were outside and inside, seen in the windows, in the mirror, even in the black corners of the room. Daddy Pig grabbed the children's hands, but a step backward changed nothing. Behind them, the walls were no longer walls. Instead of wallpaper rose damp tree trunks, and roots pushed up through the floor. The house was turning into forest. Mummy Pig held George tight. Peppa clung to Daddy's hand. All four huddled in one corner, but corners no longer existed. The house dissolved, and the forest took its place. The whisper filled everything. It almost sounded like words, but none could be understood. Only one feeling remained. There was nowhere to go. The last thing the family saw was the creature's antlers breaking through the ceiling and its red eyes reflecting in every window at once. Since then, no one has seen the pig family. Their house still stands in the same place, but on rainy evenings it seems to merge with the forest. Inside it smells of resin and damp bark. Stains darken the walls, and pine cones lie in the corners. They say sometimes through the glass you can glimpse reflections, not just empty rooms, but red eyes, unblinking and cold. And in the thicket near the house, children's voices are heard, calling for help. The deer monster no longer returns to the forest. Now he is here, and he waits.
This episode of the animated series, Peppa Pig, has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the pig family's house. The wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside, but something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like two black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then, she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin. Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward, and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows. The walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Daddy Pig was in his study, engrossed in his newspaper. But the rustling of the pages sounded like dry, brittle wings. The antique globe on his desk spun slowly on its own, its continents shifting and blurring. A faint, musty smell filled the room. The ink on the newspaper began to bleed, forming strange, cryptic symbols. Daddy Pig seemed oblivious. The bookshelves appeared to lean precariously. A cold draft swept through the room. Peppa tiptoed to the study door. The familiar ticking of Daddy Pig /S watch had morphed into a slow, deliberate thumping. The air grew heavy. The symbols on the newspaper began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. Daddy Pig looked up, his eyes wide and unseeing. He spoke, but his voice was not his own. He gestured towards the globe, which now pulsed with the same green light. The continents on it rearranged themselves into a map of an unknown, terrifying place. The books on the shelves began to fall. The study was no longer a place of quiet contemplation. Peppa backed away, her heart pounding. The thumping of the watch grew louder. The green light intensified. Daddy Pig rose from his chair, his movements stiff and unnatural. The study door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The air grew thick with an unseen presence. The house was no longer a home, but a predator. The finality of her fate hung heavy in the air. The walls seemed to close in. There was no escape, no hope, only the hungry silence and the unblinking eye of their doom. The house had claimed its prize, and the game was over. For now.
One evening, when the usual quiet filled Peppa Pig's house, Peppa noticed something strange in her room. On the carpet, right by her bed, lay a small yellow toy. It looked like a little creature with huge black eyes and a wide smile, too straight and motionless to be friendly. "George, look!" Peppa said, picking up the toy. "We've never had this one before." George shrugged. "Maybe it's your new toy." But Peppa was certain she had never seen it before. The toy was light but strangely cold, as if it wasn't made of fabric at all, but of something damp and alive. The next day, she noticed something even more disturbing. On the wall, directly across from her bed, a new window had appeared. It was narrow and tall. Beyond the glass stretched a thick forest full of fog, and among the trees moved dozens of little figures, all exactly like her toy. They stood motionless, staring straight into her room. "Mummy, look!" Peppa called. "There's a window, and the toy is smiling." But Mummy Pig saw nothing. To her, it was just a wall, and the toy wasn't there at all. "You've been playing too much, Peppa," Mummy said gently. "It's time for bed." That night, Peppa woke to a whisper. The toy was sitting on her pillow, quietly repeating, "We're waiting for you. Look through the window." Beyond the glass, the forest was alive. The creatures moved closer, and there were even more of them now. All of them whispered in one voice, "Join us!" Each night, Peppa woke to the same whisper. At first, it was only words. Then she noticed her skin turning a faint shade of yellow. George tried to tell their parents that his sister looked strange, but they only smiled, not seeing anything unusual. On the third night, Peppa's eyes began to darken. She stared into the mirror for a long time, watching as the whites turned grey, until finally they became two black circles. On the fourth night, there were even more creatures in the forest. Their ranks stretched between the trees, and all of them reached out thin hands toward the window. The whisper grew louder, their voices blending into a single chant. "Soon you will be one of us. They're my friends," Peppa whispered to George. "Soon you'll see them too." On the fifth night, her smile grew wider and froze on her face, just like the toys. George began to cry and ran to his parents, but they only patted his head. "It was just a dream," said Mummy Pig. By morning, when they returned to the room, Peppa looked normal again. The toy had vanished, but at night it always came back. The sixth night was the longest. Peppa sat by the window, speaking with the creatures. At first, she whispered, then she spoke aloud. She repeated the words they taught her, words George didn't understand. The forest seemed to sway in rhythm with her voice, and the shadows appeared to move with her breath. On the seventh night, everything ended. Peppa stood by the window. Her skin was now fully yellow, her eyes black, her smile stretched so wide her face no longer looked like her own. The toy sat beside her, whispering, "The time has come." The creatures in the forest parted, opening a path. Peppa stepped toward the glass and vanished into it, as if it had turned to water. The room was empty. On the windowsill lay a small yellow toy. Now it whispered to Mummy Pig whenever she entered the room. A week passed. George was playing when he noticed a new toy lying on the floor, exactly the same as Peppa's. On the wall, another window had appeared. In its depths, shrouded in fog, stood Peppa. She was smiling her wide smile and calling to her brother. The cycle had begun again. Peppa Pig, Eyes in the Dark. In the pig family's house, an unusual silence reigned. Lately, George had hardly spoken to his sister. He no longer played with his dinosaur, didn't ask for bedtime stories, and didn't laugh the way he used to. Instead, he spent long hours sitting at the table by the window, clutching a pencil. Sheets of paper were scattered everywhere, on the floor, on the chair, even by the bed. All of them were covered with the same strange symbols, circles with short lines, resembling eyes. "George, what are these drawings?" Peppa asked cautiously. Her brother slowly turned to her. His gaze was unusual, heavy, and somehow too grown up. "You'll find out soon," he whispered, and bent over the papers again. Peppa felt her little hooves grow cold. George was becoming more and more withdrawn, as if his attention was fixed on something she couldn't see. One night, when they were both already lying in their beds, Peppa noticed that George wasn't asleep. He sat right on his sheets, staring at the ceiling. His eyes shimmered strangely, reflecting the moonlight. But there was no warmth in that gleam. It felt as if a bottomless depth was hiding inside them, one she could fall into. "George," Peppa whispered. He didn't answer. He only smiled, in a way he had never smiled before. The next morning, George's bed was empty. His favorite dinosaur lay torn to pieces on the floor. Above his pillow, on the wall, scratches had appeared. Symbols like eyes, as if someone had carved them with a sharp claw. "George!" Peppa called. But the room remained silent. She rushed through the house, searching for her brother in the garden, the kitchen, the living room. But George was nowhere. Everything around her felt too quiet, as if time itself had stopped. When Peppa returned to their room, her eyes fell on the large mirror hanging on the wall. Her heart froze. In the reflection behind her stood George. She spun around quickly. No one was there. But in the mirror, he remained, staring. His eyes glowed with a dim, sickly light, and his lips stretched into a smile. Peppa backed away, and then she noticed that next to George in the reflection sat Labubu. The toy looked almost the same as always, but its eyes flickered with a red glow. On its face lingered the same eerie smile as George's. "George is no more," came a strange voice from the mirror. It was low, drawn out, and echoed both in the room and inside her head. Peppa pressed herself to the wall. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. the shapes of George and Labubu moved forward toward the glass. Their outlines became sharper, as if they were about to break through. "No!" Peppa screamed. She dashed toward the door, but suddenly froze. In the mirror, her own bed reflected as empty, and on it sat Labubu, very close now, with glowing eyes and a crooked smile. The mirror trembled, and the shadows nearly tore their way out. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look. When she opened them again, the mirror was ordinary. The room was silent. Only George's bed remained empty. Later that night, when their parents had gone to sleep, Peppa sat on her bed, staring at the shelf where Labubu now stood again. He looked harmless, soft, and familiar. But now she knew the truth. His eyes were no longer lifeless buttons. In their dim glow flickered the same cold emptiness she had seen in George. And in the corner of the room, near the mirror, a crack was slowly spreading. It widened as if something unseen was watching from behind the wall.